Good afternoon. Thank you for joining the Second Chance Act Innovative Reentry Initiative Grant Program Solicitation webinar. The purpose of this webinar today is to share information about this grant program, provide an overview of main requirements, address application and selection criteria, and offer resources and answer any questions you may have about the process. We will be referring to the Innovative Reentry Initiative Grant Program as IRI. My name is Tara Donraj. I am a policy analyst at the Council of State Governments Justice Center and will be presenting today alongside Heather Tubman-Carbone, Senior Policy Advisor at the Bureau of Justice Assistance, U.S. Department of Justice, and my colleague Olivia Kukui. Thanks to all of you for joining the webinar and to BJA for partnering with us on this presentation. Before getting started, I'd like to briefly talk through a couple of housekeeping items about how the webinar will work. Anytime during this webinar, you can ask a question by typing it into the Q&A panel on the bottom right-hand portion of your screen. This includes both technical and content-related questions. We will try to reply to technical questions in the chat window as we go. For the content-related questions, we will keep a running list and address them all at the end of the webinar. We'll do our best to get through as many as possible. If you encounter technical or audio problems during this webinar, please call WebEx Technical Support at 1-866-229-3239. Please understand that there are some technical issues you may not be able to resolve. For this reason, we are recording the content portion of this webinar and will post it on our website at csgjusticecenter.org/NRRC. We should have the webinar posted online early next week. Once it has been posted, we will email you a link to the recording. Today's webinar is organized into 5 parts. I'll provide an introduction to the NRRC. Heather of BJA will walk us through the overview of IRI. We will discuss some of BJA's expectations for grantees and some key program requirements. We will then highlight the application process. To close out, we'll provide contact information, resources, and host a Q&A session to address any questions. To begin, we're going to take a quick poll. Eligible applicants are units of state, county, or local governments and federally recognized Indian tribal governments. We would like to take a moment to find out more about who's on the line. Please direct your eye to the right-hand side of your screen. The poll should close in about 15 seconds. All right, it takes just a moment for the results to come up, so we're just waiting for those before we continue. So it looks like we have a variety of different people on the webinar this afternoon, with the majority from county or local government agency, and then following behind that, state government agencies serving adults. To get started, I want to give a quick overview of the Justice Center. The Justice Center is a national nonprofit organization that serves policymakers at the local, state, and federal levels from all branches of government. Staff provide practical, nonpartisan advice and evidence-based, consensus-driven strategies to increase public safety and strengthen communities. You can find our website at csgjusticecenter.org and can follow us on Twitter at CSGJC. In addition to serving policymakers, the Justice Center provides technical assistance to all Second Chance Act grantees through the National Reentry Resource Center, or NRRC, which is funded through the Department of Justice's Bureau of Justice Assistance. The NRRC was authorized by the passage of the Second Chance Act in April 2008 and launched by the Council of State Governments in October of 2009. We are constantly adding new content and resources to our website, and we send out a monthly newsletter that provides information about the latest research, funding opportunities, distance learning events, and other news about reentry. We encourage everyone who hasn't done so already to sign up for the newsletter by going to csgjusticecenter.org/subscribe. The newsletter highlights second chance grantees, provides information on new publications and resources, as well as updates recipients on trainings, relevant news, and most appropriate for this webinar, the latest reentry funding opportunities. I will take a moment now to turn it over to Heather from BJA.
Thanks, Tara. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for your interest in the IRI grant and for joining us today. As Tara said, I'll provide a brief background about BJA and the funding source for this program, and then I'll get into an overview of the purpose and structure of the grant to inform your application. I'll then hand things back to Tara to get into more detail about the types of activities you might propose and tips for preparing your application. The Bureau of Justice Assistance is an agency within the Office of Justice Programs at the Department of Justice. We sit at the intersection of policy and practice. Our mission is to provide leadership and services in grant administration and criminal justice policy development to support state, local, and tribal communities such as yourselves. And we do that in part by keeping a finger on the pulse of the field. What's happening, what's needed, what's working, what's not, and what do we need to learn more about. And then we provide funding to jurisdictions across the country to address those challenges and to test new strategies to advance us all. Next slide, please. One of the types of funding we push out through grants comes from the Second Chance Act, signed by then President Bush in 2008 and reauthorized recently in 2018. The Second Chance Act has supported over $400 million in reentry investments to a variety of initiatives across the country through several grant programs. This one, Innovative Reentry Initiative, is one of many. Next slide, please. We are interested to know if you have previously applied for SCA grant funding. In the right-hand column on your screen, please click yes or no to indicate whether you have previously applied for an SCA grant. We'll give it just another moment here. If you haven't already, please look on the right side of your screen and click yes or no to indicate whether you have previously applied for an SCA grant. It does not have to be Innovations in Reentry, it could be any SCA grant. All right, it looks like the majority of folks on the line have not previously applied for an SCA grant or have not been able to answer us, and a few folks have applied in the past. Regardless of your response, I encourage you to continue listening in today and to apply. Thank you all who responded. Next slide, please. If you apply for this grant and are accepted, you will join a large group of agencies throughout the country dedicated to improving the pre- and post-release services in their communities. Through fiscal year 18, there have been 180 awards and over $60 million in funding to grantees in this program. Over the years, the name has changed. When it started, this was the Prisoner Reentry Initiative. Then it was the Adult Offender Reentry Program for Planning and Demonstration Projects. Then the two-phase Adult Reentry Demonstration Program, then Smart Reentry, then Innovations in Reentry, and now Innovative Reentry Initiative. So if you've heard any of those names before, they were prior iterations of this program, and the program itself has changed a bit over the years. Next slide, please. For this year, the purpose of the Innovative Reentry Initiatives program is to provide state and local jurisdictions and Indian tribes with the resources and training and technical assistance necessary to identify assets and gaps in your reentry system and to develop capacity and partnerships to address them by providing services that prevent recidivism, reduce crime, and improve public safety. IRI is part of BJA's Innovations in Public Safety portfolio, known as the Innovation Suite. The Innovation Suite of programs invests in the development of practitioner research partnerships that use data, evidence, and innovation to create and test strategies that are effective and economical. This data-driven approach enables jurisdictions to understand the full nature and extent of the crime challenges they face and to direct resources to the highest priorities. As such, grantees in this program are required to evaluate the activities and strategies that they implement. and you'll hear more about that as we go on. Next slide, please. In sum, the overall objective of the IRI is to support the development and implementation of comprehensive reentry strategies to reduce recidivism among reentering offenders who are at medium to high risk for recidivating. We define reentry as beginning at the time of incarceration and continuing through reintegration into the community. Next slide, please. In this program, in this fiscal year, BJA expects to make up to 15 awards of $1 million each. All awards are expected to begin on or around the announcement date of October 1 for a program period of 48 months or 4 years. That 4-year period is divided into 3 phases. The first phase is the planning phase. During the planning phase, $75,000 will be available to grantees for planning purposes. During that time, grantees will be required to participate in technical assistance and, as you may have seen in the solicitation, to complete an action plan. The action plan, also referred to sometimes as the Planning and Implementation Guide, will help you assess your reentry system and refine your proposal into a detailed work plan to do 2 things: to make general system improvements and to stand up a demonstration project. And we'll talk more about what those entail later on. During the planning phase, grantees will complete the assessment and develop that work plan and submit it to BJA. Once it is approved, the remaining funds from the award will be released and available for use. Next comes the implementation phase, where the rubber meets the road. This is where you'll put the detailed plan into action for a period of 2 years. The last year of the award period is reserved for evaluation, and funds should only be used to support that rather than to continue other project activities. The final evaluation report will be due at grant closeout. Please note that your application materials, specifically the budget, should reflect the requirements and restrictions of each of these phases. Next slide, please. I'm also excited to share that pending grantee performance and availability of future appropriations, each grantee will be considered to receive 1 supplement of up to $500,000 during the award period. More to come on this in later slides. Next slide, please. This solicitation has a match requirement. That means federal funds awarded under the solicitation may not cover more than 50% of the total costs of the program. Grant awards may be up to $1 million, so your agency must match that with another $1 million. 50% of the match needs to be a cash match. The remaining 50% can be an in-kind match. All applicants must identify the source of the 50% non-federal portion, or the match portion, of the total program costs and how you will use the match funds. The Attorney General may waive the match requirement upon determination of a fiscal hardship for individual applications. However, this is discretionary and not guaranteed. To be considered for a waiver of match, a letter of request must be signed by the authorized representative and submitted with the application defining the fiscal hardship. Fiscal hardship may be defined in terms related to reductions in overall budget, furloughs, or reductions in force of staff, or other similar documented actions which have resulted in severe budget reductions. Detailed information must be provided with match waiver requests. Please note, a match waiver request must be submitted as a separate attachment to the application and titled as a match waiver. And now I'll hand things back over to Tara. I'll remain on the line and I'm happy to answer any questions at the end of the webinar. Thanks again for joining us.
Thank you, Heather. Let's take a look at the FY19 IRI solicitation program requirements and expectations. Now that we understand the general objectives and goals for the Innovative Reentry Initiative, what should the proposal specifically look like? Part of the planning process, which we will get into momentarily, will include assessing your reentry system and identifying strengths and gaps. Once identified, the grantee will build capacity in 2 ways. First, general system improvements. These improvements will benefit all individuals in reentry. This can include updating and developing standard operating procedures, aligning hiring, training, and performance standards, or updating partnerships and service provider agreements. The second component of building capacity is a reentry demonstration or pilot project. This will specifically impact a population within the general reentry population. Identified through data analysis as having a relatively high recidivism rate, the grantee must show reason to serve this subset. Let's now take a look at the timeline. Although the grant award is for 48 months, implementation will not be for the entire 48 months. Developing a realistic timeline in your proposal will ensure you have identified an accurate number of participants to serve, what activities you can accomplish during implementation, allow time for data analysis and final evaluation efforts, and ensure your budget matches each of these components. What does the grant timeline look like when you break it down? Typically, up to 1 year will be spent working on the planning and implementation guide. However, this time period can be anywhere from 6 to 12 months, depending on grantee progress and BJA approval. 24 months will be spent implementing the project. If it takes less than 12 months in the planning phase, the additional saved months will be added to implementation. Finally, 1 year is allocated for completing the evaluation. The grantee will have up to 12 months and access to $75,000 for planning purposes only during Phase 1. During this time frame, the grantee will develop and/or engage with a pre-existing task force and with the task force assess policies and practices in place. Appendix A on page 40 of the RFP, you can see a breakdown of the 4 capacity areas that must be assessed. Appendix A of the RFP will also provide in-depth details regarding the assessment. In addition, once a grantee, your technical assistance provider will assist you in completing the assessment through a structured action planning guide or planning and implementation guide. Utilizing the assessment results, the grantee will develop a plan to address general system improvements and the demonstration project. Applicants should propose system improvements and a demonstration project based upon known or anticipated gaps and deficits. For the demonstration project, applicants must provide detailed information and data proving they can serve the number of individuals identified in the target population. During the planning phase as a grantee, proposed activities can be revised based upon assessment results. Similarly to Action Plan Part 1, the technical assistance provider will provide assistance in completing Action Plan Part 2 through a structured action planning guide that will include each required component. The implementation phase will last for at least 24 months. The remaining $925,000 will be released to the grantee but must be managed between Phase 2 and 3. During this time frame, the grantee will implement the general system improvement and demonstration project. A preliminary process evaluation will be due 18 months into implementation. This process evaluation should not assess the planning phase, but primarily focus on what has occurred during the year and a half of implementation. During this phase, BJA will consider supplemental funding of $500,000 if there is a need. The supplemental funding, if granted, would come with a 1-year extension. This extension would extend the grant out to the 5-year maximum limit, meaning no other grant extensions could be allowed. The final phase of the project is the evaluation phase. This 12-month period will not include any implementation activities, and funding can only be used to evaluate the program. A preliminary outcome or impact evaluation is due at month 36, and a final process and outcome evaluation is due at grant closeout. Appendix C on page 45 of the RFP shows what recidivism metrics must be measured. Before moving on, I would like to note that each of the deliverables mentioned in phases 1 through 3 address all mandatory Second Chance Act requirements listed on page 7 and 8 of the RFP. Now that we have completed a conceptual overview and discussed deliverables of each phase, let's go back through to see what this could look like in action. During the planning phase, grantees will assess themselves in the following domains. A data assessment includes looking at data collection, processes, sharing, and decision-making. Pre-release planning looks at policies, practices, and resources in place to improve outcomes of individuals when re-entering the community. For example, is a validated risk and needs assessment administered to all individuals, At what point in the process are they assessed? And how frequently is the assessment administered? Staff capacity aims to assess if staff resources are allocated in a way to maximize impact. For example, job-related training staff may receive or having adequate time and resources available for staff to complete all assigned duties. Behavioral health includes assessing if there are effective pre- and post-release treatment resources in place to address the needs. And finally, a community supervision assessment includes determining if effective collaboration is in place between jails, prisons, and community correction agencies, such as probation and parole. The results will reveal strengths, gaps, and areas for improvement. As you briefly look over this list now, you may already have an idea where your jurisdiction may thrive or need additional support. Once each domain is assessed, the grantee will map out a detailed plan to address some or all of the needs through system improvements and the demonstration pilot project. General system improvements can look very different. An example we have seen other grantees do in the past is implement ethics training, which provides evidence-based training to probation officers to improve supervision strategies. Implementing motivational interviewing agency-wide is another example where these skills become integrated into agents' supervision or communication practices. We have also seen agencies put risk assessment protocols or information sharing agreements in place to formalize a process that may or may not have already been occurring. The demonstration or pilot project will focus on specific subsets of the reentry population. Subsets include specific demographics, such as age, race, or gender, a specific area where disproportionately high numbers of people return to the community, such as a specific neighborhood or zip code, or individuals housed in the same facility prior to release in the community. The demonstration project itself can include expanding or improving an existing project within a jurisdiction or implementing a new project altogether. An example of a demonstration project is if a jurisdiction provides gender-specific continuum of care grounded in evidence-based supervision and treatment to ensure individualized systems of support to women being released from incarceration back into the community. The grantee could partner with community health workers to establish and maintain relationships with program participants, providing pre-release care and delivering wraparound services and support. Wraparound services in the community could include trauma treatment, transitional housing, parenting resources and skill development, and medication-assisted treatment with evidence-based case management strategies. Priority consideration will be given to those that, 1, reduce violent recidivism among medium and high-risk offenders through validated assessment tools. The proposals must include a description of how this group will be identified and demonstrate access to and use of relevant data. Please note that this does not mean you must focus on the highest need population. If there are already services in your jurisdiction for the highest need individuals, it may make sense to focus on the medium risk population. 2, target offenders with histories of homelessness, substance use, mental illness, including a pre-release assessment of the housing status of the individual and their behavioral health needs to inform individual release plans that coordinate mental health, substance use, and homelessness service systems to achieve stable and permanent housing outcomes with appropriate support. 3, improve reentry-related services in geographic areas with disproportionately large number of reentrants. These do not need to be designated opportunity zones. Proposals, though, must include data to demonstrate that a higher concentration of adults return from incarceration to the identified community than to others in the jurisdiction or the surrounding jurisdictions. And finally, 4, employ randomized controlled trial methods to assess the effectiveness of programs and practices. We have seen several grantees in the past propose to conduct a randomized controlled trial and then change their evaluation method upon full understanding of what this entails. If an applicant would like to utilize this method, we strongly encourage meeting with an evaluation partner prior to applying to determine that this is feasible for the proposed project, evaluator, and timeline. Before moving on to the application process, we'd like to share some keys to success. Since we have seen quite a few grantees come through this program so far, we wanted to highlight for you some things that tend to be associated with more successful initiatives. There are important components These are important components that have led to previous success and should be considered as you prepare your proposal. The Reentry Task Force provides a key opportunity for policymakers to work together to identify and address barriers to effective reentry, including barriers that are both policy or procedural in nature. It is important to have the decision makers on your task force to make these system changes. Collaboration with your research partner is critical. Connection to agencies that attend to health, mental health, housing, homeless services, child welfare, education, substance use, victim services, state child support, and employment services will provide the wraparound services needed for successful reentry into the community. Finally, grantees are required to participate in technical assistance from the NRRC. TA providers meet monthly with BJA, summarizing updates on grantees' progress and achievements. Your TA provider offers assistance in completion of the Action Planning Guide, identifying measures to track progress, providing resources to support your initiative, connections to peers, and the ability to highlight the successes with others in the field. Maintaining communication and connection with your TA provider is key to a successful grant experience. Now we're going to move to the application process. BJA has hosted a series of webinars to assist applicants with applying for federal awards. The series include topics such as funding opportunities for your community in 2019, the first steps to applying, what applicants should consider, and avoiding common mistakes. Go to the links provided to view pre-recorded webinars. You will have 20 pages double-spaced in the program narrative to address the areas on this slide, excluding the budget. This is your opportunity to tell your story based upon data about the need for addressing re-entry issues in your jurisdiction, and to demonstrate that you have the ability to take on each of the tasks outlined in the program requirements. After reading the application and requirements twice, think about the steps you need to do first, or the steps that will take the most time, and do those first, such as registrations, letters of support or MOUs, and inviting partners to planning meetings. The biggest mistake applicants make is not answering every question. Other common mistakes we have seen are changing the order of structure of the review criteria when developing the program narrative, exceeding stated page limitations, or not adhering to formatting guidelines. For the demonstration pilot project, you must complete a case flow analysis confirming the demonstration project will serve 150 individuals. Indicate the number of individuals returning to the community who would receive services through the demonstration program over the length of the grant. If awarded funds, grantee performance will be measured against this number. If the applicant is requesting funds for a program that is currently operational, the applicant must state how many offenders the program has served who meet the stated target population characteristics over the past 6 months. If the applicant is proposing to implement a new program, the applicant must state how many individuals met the target population characteristics within the past 6 months. Drafting the budget. Make sure you carefully read to understand any caps on expenses or unallowable expenses. Utilize the DOJ Grants Financial Guide for assistance. There is a combined budget and budget narrative template for your use that is linked to the solicitation. Within the budget detail worksheet, there is a sample worksheet that has been included as a resource. Refer to the tab labeled Example Budget Detail Worksheet. Common mistakes seen during the budget development phase include waiting too long to begin, lack of understanding required budget expenses, allowable and unallowable costs, and not clearly stating activities of any contracted services. Common mistakes seen with the budget narrative include not including thorough and clear descriptions of every cost listed in the narrative section for each budget category. Ensure that you triple check that each item has been addressed and attached to the application for a strong and complete application. We recommend utilizing Appendix D on page 46 of the RFP and application checklist to ensure all required items are completed and attached. Before submitting, applicants must register through grants.gov. Once this is complete, applications can be submitted through grants.gov and must be submitted no later than June 25th, 2019. Now we're going to move to the final section of the webinar. Please utilize the contact information on this page for any assistance submitting an application or technical issues that may arise. The resources on this page and the next serve to assist you with your application. Please review them for helpful tips and suggestions for submitting a complete application. Now we're going to move to the Q&A section of our webinar. Okay, so this first question looks like it's for Heather from BJA. I would like additional clarity on the difference between what we are expected to propose within the original application versus developed during the planning period, such as target population and budgeted activities.
Absolutely. Thank you for the question. So it's a fine line. The application process, by definition, because it's a competitive process, requires everyone to propose what they will do and who they will serve and how they will spend the budget in doing so. During the planning phase, that assessment is meant to help you refine those plans, and at times it can help you uncover other targets. That's the answer, but I want to give you sort of detail on two planes. People who are applying for this, or agencies that are applying, tend to fall into one of two camps. One is they have great data and personnel resources available and can do all of this digging and make the case for why they are proposing certain activities up front. However, we are very sensitive to those agencies that are stretched super thin, do not have access to data, and maybe do not have the personnel to assess or evaluate and analyze the data that they do have in hand. And so that's why we're building in this process to help refine whatever they have proposed. Now, we do want you to propose what you plan to do and your target population. However, if during that planning process you were to identify particular gaps in reentry services, or say your own data capacity or staff training or whatever it is, on that list of assessment areas that Tara walked through, there is a grant adjustment process in which you could propose to shift a bit of your budget to address this new area. Now, I'm not necessarily encouraging that. It's neither a positive or a negative. So I appreciate the question because it is a very fine line. We do want you to propose what you're going to ultimately do. We don't want to see a major change, but at the same time, we appreciate that this grant is partially to help you explore those things. So you may propose, you may say, our understanding at this time is that we have X, Y, and Z needs, and here's how we plan to address them. And then during the planning process, you dig in and it turns out that X and Y, yeah, they're there, they're big, but the Z need maybe is not as glaring or as significant as something new that you identify. And so we want to create space for you to build that in. And we see this as a bit of flexibility so that everyone can do what is best for their agency. I hope that was helpful.
Thank you for the thorough answer, Heather. Another question we have that came in that I also believe is for you. What happens if a jurisdiction does not have a validated assessment tool in place? How would they identify medium to high-risk individuals when applying?
Another fantastic question. So, and this, to be honest, is a perfect illustration of why we built in the flexibility that I mentioned in my prior answer. So you should use any data that you have on hand or any information that is used to make decisions about release or about connections to services. At the end of the day, if there is no risk assessment in place, certainly we don't expect you to report on people's risk levels. However, we expect you to address it by explaining what you are doing. And frankly, you should, if you propose to adopt a risk assessment as part of this process, that would strengthen the application.
Great, thank you. Here's a two-part question for you. So one, who qualifies as a third-party evaluator? And then two, do we need that evaluator or research partner before or during the application process, or do we identify and shape the partnership during the planning phase?
Y'all are coming in with great questions. So who qualifies as a third-party evaluator is someone whose expertise is in evaluation and ideally has a background in corrections, reentry, criminal justice more broadly, but who is familiar with the type of data that you will need them to assess in order to determine what is going on in your project and how effective it is. So that may be a private organization, that may be a local or not local, as it were, university. We strongly encourage partnerships with universities, especially local ones, simply because those are often easier to sustain. So that's the answer to the first part. In terms of when to bring them on, this is one that really depends on the procurement rules of the applying jurisdiction. In an ideal world, maybe you have an existing partnership with an evaluation group, or you have someone in mind you want to work with. Ideally, you put your heads together on the application, you write in together, you get a letter of support from them. It does not take that much of their time for them to write in and say, hey, if this award were to come out, were to come our way, we absolutely intend to partner with this state agency. That being said, procurement rules in your jurisdiction may require you to first receive the award and then put out an RFP to solicit competitively for an evaluator. If that is the case, we absolutely respect that, and then that's the process you should follow.
Great, thank you. Another question that came in, is it likely that this RFP will be repeated in fiscal year 2020?
There are no guarantees, but we always make available a solicitation like this, something that is explicitly designed to support reentry services. So it may not look exactly the same. For instance, like this fiscal year 2019 solicitation looks different than the fiscal year 2018 or the 2017 before it, but the eligible applicants and the overall purpose are the same, and I would expect that to continue.
Great. Are U.S. territories eligible for this grant?
Absolutely.
Fantastic. Have match waivers been granted in the past?
Yes, they have. Match waivers have been granted. They have also been denied. It really is dependent on the individual situation of the jurisdiction. For example, this past year, I can recall we had applications, we had match waiver requests come in from a handful of applicants, and among them, a couple provided documentation from recent legislative sessions and then the agency budgets to show that there had been drastic cuts. And in fact, there were reductions in workforce and so many vacant positions. And from that evidence, it was a very clear case that this was not a matter of whether or not this was an agency priority, but in fact that the support just wouldn't have existed. And in those cases, the match waiver was granted. So it's really, yes, they are absolutely granted. It's on an individual basis, and the evidence has to be there. So just supply that as attachments to a letter.
Thank you, Heather. We've got a lot of good questions coming in. The next one is, what are the requirements around the makeup and activities of a task force? Can it be either an existing body, or can you propose to create a new body?
It can absolutely be either one. If you have an existing body that is high functioning and you believe can serve this purpose, we would encourage you to either build on or continue with that task force, just because of the time it takes typically to get everyone on board and to orient them. But if that task force is not already in existence, absolutely create one for the purpose of this project. I think if you go through the solicitation, in the appendices where you'll see some specifics about what you would assess during the planning period, and then how you will be the things you'll have to evaluate, I think that'll give you a sense of the types of things that this task force will have to be aware of or understand. One way I would say, just as a last note, one way I would think of the task force is the task force themselves as a group are not necessarily going to be the ones doing the heavy lifting to get this work done, but they should be people who have the authority or the power to help troubleshoot and remove roadblocks along the way.
Great, thank you. Could we be competitive by meeting some but not all of the priority considerations?
That's a fantastic question. I'm glad someone asked. The answer is absolutely yes. Here's how the priority considerations work. First, everyone's application is considered on the basis of whether or not you are proposing feasible yet ambitious activities that meet the purpose of this solicitation, and applications are scored accordingly. Think of the priority considerations as like an opportunity for an extra points. So somebody could meet all of the priority considerations but not have a strong proposal otherwise, and in that case, they would not be awarded, because first step is having a strong proposal that meets everything else. The priority consideration is kind of like just an extra point. I don't mean to undermine it. It's significant, it matters, but it's not the whole story.
Great. Can and have public defender offices applied for this grant in the past?
That's a tough one. I'm not certain whether they have in the past. The tricky thing here is, and I would say this is true of all BJA grant programs, is that the receiving agency or the applicant agency must have the authority or power to connect with the target population. And so a public defender, in my mind, as I would envision how this plays out, a public defender's office, I think, is an incredibly strong and valuable partner, and that we've seen in the past. But as a primary applicant, that's tough, because when we're talking about reentry, again, being defined as starting at the time of incarceration and continuing through reintegration into the community, that means that whoever's running this program must have access to individuals both prior to and post-release. And while public defenders certainly have that for the clients they are defending, they don't necessarily have, they don't typically, I should say, have the reach required to do the entirety of this project. So I think it really depends on what's being proposed, and I would recommend a partnership with a DOC or a jail who runs the reentry activities.
Fantastic, thank you. Another question. Often, these grants are awarded to existing programs that are looking to expand their current work. What is the likelihood that a new or innovative program would be competitive?
I can't give any sort of statistic on this simply because I don't have one, but I would say it's very likely. In fact, we do it every year. I would say, even just thinking about the past 2 years, there's a nice mix of places that had something in place or partially in place, and then places that were doing something brand new. On any given year, we have to make decisions based on the applications that come before us. And so again, in any given year, it may be that the majority of applicants have something going on that they want to improve or expand or scale up, or in any given year, places are proposing brand new things. So it really depends on the quality of the application. We're looking for a handful of things. So to recap a couple of things that were mentioned or alluded to over the course of the presentation today, we are looking for proposals that meet these objectives. So identify the gaps and opportunities in the continuum of reentry services and propose how to improve them in 2 ways. One is the general system improvements, the stuff that's going to help the entire agency and everyone who comes through it. And then the other is that demonstration project for a specific group. I'm thinking that this question is referring more to places where the demonstration project is something that's already in place and they're either expanding it or improving it in some way. That's only one piece. So that step's got to be in place. It's got to be a strong idea. But the other things that we're looking at are just what are the likelihood of success? Because the grants are an investment from BJA, just like you would make any investment in your personal finance portfolio. So we will look at every single thing in that application and determine what's the likelihood of success. So for example, if someone proposes to do a randomized controlled trial and then proceeds to allocate $40,000 for the evaluation, we're going to look at that and say, that's not enough money to support that activity. Therefore, we're not giving the full amount of points possible when we assess that part of the application. And we'll do the same thing for the rest of the criteria. So if a demonstration project proposes to serve, let's say, if you propose to serve 200, let's make this easy, 150 individuals over a period of 2 years of implementation, and those individuals in the target population are going to be women assessed as having a high risk of recidivism returning to 2 communities. And then as you're walking through the data in the proposal, if we read something like only 40 women who meet those criteria are released every year, we would say, oh, okay, well, it's great to target to serve 150, but it sounds like in a 2-year period, you're only going to get 80. So that's not feasible. That's not a high likelihood of success. So all of that to say, in a very circular way, having something in place does not necessarily give a leg up. It does say that you have a great track record, but I would absolutely not decide not to apply just because you don't have something in place. I wouldn't assume that some place that has, I'm using the word place a lot, I would not assume that let's say a competitor applicant who has something in place automatically has a leg up on that basis, because that's just not how we look at it.
Great, thank you, Heather. Another question. I take it that a name brand evidence-based intervention need not be in the proposal, but it is essential for the proposed intervention to include program strategies and/or activities similar to programs that are evidence-based. Can you comment on this?
I'm not entirely sure I understand the question, so I'm going to answer quickly, and if there's a follow-up question, please go ahead and type it in. So if the question is whether or not a proposal is stronger because it's a name brand intervention as opposed to something that has research behind it and as a strategy would be sufficient, the answer is that the latter is absolutely sufficient. We're looking for innovative and evidence-based ideas. And we define that as there is something out there in the research that says this is a good idea. It doesn't necessarily have to be the tried and true model, because we largely view these grants as a learning lab. This is R&D for the field. This is our testing ground. So if it is a name brand program, great. If you know, for example, that you're planning to use a name brand program, you know you're planning to use EPICS or something like that, that should be named in the proposal. But I'm by no means suggesting that you are better off using a name brand intervention than something else. We've seen plenty of projects where jurisdictions are creating their own and they're testing it, and some of those are the most successful.
Thanks, Heather. I think that answered the question, but we'll keep an eye out for follow-up if the individual who asked that has some more context to provide. We've got a lot of questions, so I'm going to keep going, and we'll plug through right till the end of the webinar, it looks like, at 4 p.m. So our next question is, if our reentry strategic plan doesn't yet have measurable annual or 3-year performance outcomes, and we want to develop them during planning, do we just state that in the application or come up with our best guess and refine during the planning phase, like with the target population?
Thank you for asking that. I would say you should go ahead and say that in the application. We absolutely want to encourage transparency. We want to hear that you've identified your trouble spots or just things that haven't yet been done that you need to complete, and that this funding is your resource for doing so. If you have some ideas or you're kind of halfway down a path and want to put those in to show us the direction you're going, that would be fantastic. But what is required is to define the problem and how you want to go about solving it. You don't have to have, the actual end game or solution in there. I think it's very appropriate, and we would encourage you to say this is something we want to work on.
Great, thank you. Is the $500,000 supplement also subject to the 50% cash match?
Yes, it has. Let me say this differently, I'm sorry. In the past, supplements to programs that require a cash match in the initial round of funding have been subject to it in the future. So my guess would be that yes, it will be, but that is something I won't know until we get to that year's appropriation and we see availability.
Great, thank you. Okay, another question. I work at a CC that is working with a nonprofit that meets most of the requirements to be the lead applicant. However, this agency does not meet the financial accountability requirements. Would it be eligible to contract with us for that element?
So this is another one of those cases where if I don't answer your question, please feel free to write in and clarify. However, I would say the nonprofit absolutely does not meet the requirements to be a lead applicant. There is a different solicitation. I believe it's called community reentry or community-based reentry. And I think the NRC hosted a webinar about that one or is hosting one as well. And that one is specifically designed for nonprofits or community groups. For this one, however, we are limited to government agencies or jurisdictions.
Back to the supplemental funding of $500,000. During the implementation phase, should the grantee look to hear from BJA about the supplemental funding, or would the grantee need to reach out to BJA and prove a need and desire for the funding, for the supplemental funding?
Yep, I'm really glad someone asked that. Thank you. So when the supplemental funding is available, we will announce that. The eligible applicants certainly will be the current awardees. What we will do is we will say to the current cohort or the cohort selected from this solicitation, we will be in touch with you and we will say, hey, this additional funding is available. If you are interested, here's how you apply to us for it. It will not be as arduous a process as the initial grant application, but the second part of that question in terms of telling why you need it and what you will do with it, that will have to be done. But we will raise the flag when it is time for that. And I can say now that the timing of that is yet to be determined because it will be based on a couple of things. One, again, is the appropriation, but the other is the progress of the cohort. And so sometimes grantees as a cohort kind of get up and running faster or slower than other years. Sometimes that's due, frankly, to BJA and the Office of Justice Programs processing of awards and budget clearances. And other times it's just, hey, this work is hard and it takes some time. So we will not make those supplements available until folks are well into implementation. So presumably that would be at about the 2-year mark, but depending on how things are going, it may be a little bit earlier or later.
Fantastic. Thank you, Heather. So I believe I'm about to ask the last question. If there are any final thoughts, questions, or concerns anyone has, please go ahead and write that in the question box. The final question that I have is, if an agency was just approved for a co-occurring grant, can that agency apply for this grant? And I'm going to make the assumption that that would be a co-occurring Second Chance Act grant.
Yep, yes, you can absolutely apply for more than one. You can be a current grant holder and apply for a new grant in a different program. The purpose of the programs is different enough that one does not disqualify you from the other. I will say that when we just make the award determinations, we look at the award history of each applicant. And so if in a case like this where there's a current or new award under another program, we would then look at the details of that award. What are the project goals? What are the activities? What does the budget say it's supporting? And we would make sure that there's no overlap. Assuming there's no overlap, it's absolutely fine.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Heather, for answering all of these questions. We have now come to the conclusion of the webinar. Thank you all for your participation, engagement, and fruitful questions. The webinar will be recorded and will be on the NRRC website next week. Thank you all for joining and have a great rest of your afternoon.